Hello, everyone, and welcome to Robert Half Real Talk, Leading Across a Multi-Generational Workforce. I'm Lorraine K. Lee, your moderator for today's session, joining you from sunny San Francisco. I am so excited to lead this timely and important conversation today about how we can prepare for the future of leadership across a workforce that spans 4 generations. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from all of you in the comments section. Where are you dialing in from? And what is one quality you think every future leader needs, regardless of age and regardless of experience? So where are you dialing in from? And what is one quality you think every future leader needs, regardless of age or experience? Drop your thoughts in the comments and I will be revisiting those shortly. Today's panel is going to take us beyond the typical conversations around succession planning. We are going to talk about what's needed next to establish long-term growth, innovation, and business continuity. We'll explore how organizations can build leadership pipelines that reflect today's evolving workforce and that are also prepared to meet tomorrow's business challenges. We'll be discussing topics like how to harness the unique strengths of every generation, best practices for building modern career development paths, ways of preserving institutional knowledge, and making space for every generation at the leadership table. Before we dive in, a quick bit of housekeeping. This session will run about 45 minutes. It is being recorded, so you can revisit it anytime. Drop your questions and comments in the chat throughout, and we will do our best to answer them live. Speaking of chat, I'm going to take a quick look at who's here and what quality our audience thinks every leader should have. So we have Sarah from British Columbia, good listening skills. Ines is from Paris. Welcome, Ines. She thinks agility is the best. We have Lisa from Michigan, transparency. Susan from New York. Joan says empathy. We have compassion, communication. Satish from Portland says collaboration. Okay, amazing. I'm loving all of these adjectives. I love seeing how diverse this audience is. Thank you, everyone, for joining and for sharing. With that, I want us to meet our panelists. So Kathy Burton is the Vice President of Global Learning and Development at Robert Half. She leads initiatives that support employee growth and leadership development across the organization with a focus on building future-ready talent. We have Megan W. Gerhardt. She is the founder and director of thought leadership at gentelligence.org. She is a professor, an author, and a speaker who specializes in leveraging generational diversity as a strategic advantage in the workplace. And then last but certainly not least, we have Varsha Sharma. She is the editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue, where she leads editorial strategy and champions inclusive storytelling. She brings a unique perspective on how younger generations are shaping culture, leadership, and the future of work. And as I mentioned before, I'm Lorraine K. Lee. I'm a keynote speaker and the best-selling author of Unforgettable Presence. And before that, I spent the first decade of my career as a founding editor at companies like LinkedIn and Prezi. So let's give a wave. Hello, panelists. Thank you for being here today. Amazing to see you all. And I thought it would be fun to start off our conversation today with a bit of an icebreaker so everyone in the audience can get to know our panelists a little bit better. So as I was thinking about, okay, what topic should I ask about today? Because it needs to be a topic that spans generations, given the theme of our session today. I realized that emojis would be the perfect topic. Now, I have seen some hot debates around emoji usage and what exactly they mean. For example, what is considered friendly by one generation might come off as sarcastic or maybe even passive-aggressive to another. I remember being shocked learning that the smiley face, which to me, of course, obviously meant being happy, might actually be seen as maybe patronizing by Gen Z. So my question for today for all of us, for all of you panelists is, what is the emoji that you use the most? And what do you use it for? What does it mean to you? And to our audience, why don't you also throw your most used emoji in the chat and what you think it means? So Varsha, let's start with you. What is your most used emoji?
It's kind of a boring answer, I'll be honest. I do the thumbs up or the white check mark, which I know that there's also been some discussion about whether the thumbs up is considered passive aggressive in my workplace. At least it is not. But the more fun one that I use pretty frequently too is the 2 red exclamation points. It's called bang bang. And I use that for emphasis or agreement. And that's something that me and my colleagues use a lot too.
Nice. What about you, Megan?
I don't know that mine's all that exciting, but I do tend to use the winking emoji, and I think it's my way of making sure the text is interpreted as being fun or not too serious, making sure my tone is clear. So I'm definitely in the winking emoji camp over here.
Love that. And what about you, Kathy?
I tend to use the cringe emoji because I always go for the self-defamation. My nieces and nephews always keep me very honest on the emoji game.
Nice. I would say like the most interesting one maybe is like, those like 2 eye emojis. And to me, that means like, oh, I see your message, like I'm acknowledging it. And then I remember one of my interns, Gen Z, said to me, oh, that to us, it means like you're watching us. So, okay, very different definition there. Turning to the chat here, I see one is, someone has the chef's kiss. We're seeing some laughy emojis, blushing, the 100. I use that a lot as well. The muscle strong one, upside down smile, which I feel like has many different meanings to different people. We're seeing a few of those. Yeah, prayer hand. Someone Knox, hello Knox, uses a taco emoji, right? So a lot of variation. Emojis, I think, are a continuously evolving topic. Even what we're talking about, learning about today, could even change in a few months. So always a good idea to regularly check in with your teammates to see what the latest is. So thank you all for sharing those. And I want to start us off today with a level set. Succession planning has really traditionally focused on identifying who is the next natural person in line. You had a really clear structure within a company. But these days, it seems to be more about identifying and developing the right skills and qualities to prepare for what's ahead. So I'm a millennial. I used to manage team members who were older than me, also much younger than me. And I really got to see firsthand how different generations had really different definitions of what growth looked like. So, they brought different expectations, they had different communication styles, they had different career goals. And all of those differences can make it a challenge for companies juggling all of this. So, Kathy, from your perspective at Robert Half, I'm curious, how are organizations rethinking succession planning?
Well, I think a couple things to take into consideration here. One is I think there always needs to be a lens to the future, because I think a lot of our C-suite a lot of the times have been with the organization for a really long time, are tenured or possibly have a traditional view. And so I think to really stop and think about what is it that the organization is going to need in the leadership roles in the future, say 2 or 3 years down the road. If we even think about 2 or 3 years in the rears, there were positions and roles and technology that didn't even exist. So I think having that lens to the future is a huge benefit. What do we want to be? How do we want to be? What are the roles? What is the technology that's going to be out there? What's the culture? Who are we going to have as our employee mass, and how do we keep them engaged? How do we keep them retained? How do we keep them developed? And what's the leadership mindset and skill set we need to do that? So I think that's one big one. The other thing that I would take into consideration as well is knowing what our demographic is for the organization and having a look to what is the projected growth in some of these roles, because there is a piece there to where you might have a younger demographic and they're going to be very motivated and driven to move up. And there might not be the pace of growth within the organization for that. So how do we balance keeping them engaged and developing them in a way without them feeling frustrated or passed over or don't have the patience to wait for the next open role?
I think that's such a great point, Kathy. I just wanted to jump in to echo that. It's great to hear you talk about that specifically, because that is something that I have run into myself at work, and I know other colleagues have as well. I'm a millennial. I am the oldest person on my staff. My staff is made up of younger millennials and Gen Zers. Of course, for a publication like Teen Vogue, that makes a lot of sense. But there are specific challenges that come across with that. And one of the things that I find most interesting is both the similarities and the differences between millennials and Gen Zers, because we have both. And I feel like, I entered the workforce in media shortly after the 2008 financial crisis. It was a very different time to when Gen Zers are entering the workforce. And I have noticed this kind of almost restlessness or impatience that comes along with great ambition to want to earn or get a promotion or a title change every 2 years, that I think older generations are just like, that's not how things work. That's not how things happen. But it's a completely new world for them. So I think it's really interesting and great to hear that that's something that you guys are thinking about as well, Kathy.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think, the important thing that I'm hearing in everyone is one of the things I talk about in Gentelligence, which is identifying assumptions that might be brought into a conversation. And just like the emojis, how often we think we're having the same conversation with people of different generations, and we might be on a very different page. So, for example, Lorraine, when you mentioned the idea of growth, what does growth look like? What does development look like? Just even asking that question, not only does it open up the conversation, but it allows people who have been there longer or older generations to say, well, let's talk about what growth and development look like here. And then you can figure out if there's a misalignment, a conversation about if there's a really clear reason why it takes 2 or 3 years to get to the next position. Let's talk about that so that we all understand these aren't random rules, or if they are, maybe it's time to change them. But I do think really just identifying where we may be using terms like development or feedback or growth or any of those, or even success in ways that look very different. I think that's important. I also think the generational norms we see around how to define success, does that include upward mobility? And so for it's different for every person, but I think some generations brought in a broader definition of success. We're seeing Gen Z want more balance around mental health and work life. One of my students said really profoundly last year, it feels like all the boundaries between work and life have disappeared, and we're just trying to put some of them back. And I thought, wow, I have to think about that for a minute. So perhaps, we don't want to generalize, but perhaps, the fact that success might mean upward mobility for some, and it might mean more balance and not necessarily the highest rung on the ladder for others. I think that's a really important conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all three of you touched on some important points. So then once we start understanding then the expectations, the assumptions, right, across generations, and also what we want for the company in the future, how do we start figuring out how to actually grow and nurture the people who are showing that potential? Because this is one of the most important considerations for leaders, because there's nothing worse than a teammate with tons of promise leaving because you didn't invest in them. And I say that because earlier in my career, I was that teammate, right? I left a role I loved because I just didn't see the clear path forward, and it really stuck with me. I know, Versha, you have some thoughts and have experienced this as well, so I'll throw it over to you first.
Yeah, definitely. I've been in the same exact point as you, Lorraine.
Yeah.
I have left a job for that reason as well. So now that I am a manager, I am so mindful of making sure that all of my teammates and employees who report to me feel that there is a direct path, or a clear path rather, for growth and development. And I think Megan made some great points about what that looks like and how it's different. The traditional career ladder, I think, especially in media, does not exist anymore. Maybe it exists for like one person to get to executive, but there's such a zigzag path in order to get there. And so I think one of the things that millennial leaders have really brought to the workplace as a strength is empathy, as somebody said in the comments earlier, and just the importance of listening and active listening. So just having those conversations about what does growth and development actually look like for people? What are they interested in? I'm a big believer in people being good workers and hard workers if they're actually motivated by what they do, if they feel it has some purpose. That's something we're seeing with younger generations as well, a very values-driven or purpose-driven motivation at their workplaces. And so that's just one of the things that I think is incredibly important to this conversation.
Yeah, I think, Versha, I would jump in on that one and say, I think you're right. I think potential presents itself very differently for everyone. And so I think the more exposure, the more experience, the more variation we can provide to people to engage, the more of a showcase we can give them to exercise their personal superpowers. As humans, we're all wired. We want to be seen, heard, and valued, right? And we want to feel like we're safe, we belong, and that we matter. And so at that stage of the game, it's like, how as leaders and from a learning function, how can we help provide that variation and that variety for people to find that spark of motivation where we want to get that discretionary effort. Because when you see that discretionary effort come from people, that comes from a passion, a purpose, a value-driven alignment that you can't find. You can't, there's compliance and commitment, and you want people to be committed to the cause and where they're going. And, the more that we can present different ways for people to showcase their potential, and like I said, their superpower, I think that's where we're really going to start to see people stay engaged, retained, and continue to grow, whether it is vertically or horizontally.
I would add too that really, the research confirms that if we create cultures where all ages, so everyone across all career stages feels that their age is, of course, not a hindrance. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit. But beyond that, that it is recognized as bringing a unique value, that there's value in these different generational perspectives. The research is showing that that is how an age-diverse workforce becomes an asset rather than a liability, that people become more engaged, the turnover goes down, all of the things that we hope to see. And that really does come from that trendy term of psychological safety, but psychological safety for all ages. So what that means, if you haven't heard the term, is basically that everyone feels comfortable sharing ideas and taking risks, as well as asking for help. And so to bring it back to the development question that you started with, Lorraine, what development looks like or where I need it does have likely a generational component to it. So I had a client recently that was sort of bemoaning that the young people today didn't know how to do very basic functions in their industry, and they don't know how to mop a floor, and they don't know how to answer the phone, and they don't know how to multitask. And of course, there's always a sort of a judgment in that. And that's fair. We should absolutely expect them to be able to do things we need them to do. But there's always a why, right? As overscheduled as young people are today, maybe there's less time to learn basic things like mopping, or, there's certain things, just like older people have to feel safe saying, could I head to an AI workshop because I would love to learn this, but I haven't had time. Like, I would love to just go somewhere and be able to immerse myself in it. And so meeting people where they're at, and that no matter how old we are, we should be able to say, I would love to learn this, or I could use some help doing that, as well as the flip of, I have an idea and I could share it without being called entitled, because maybe it feels too soon for me to have ideas. So we want to try to create that. And I think anyone who feels heard and seen is going to be feeling like they are developing.
Yeah, I'm so glad there are leaders like you being so thoughtful about this. Not all leaders are thinking about this right. The chat is completely agreeing with you all. So Kara says it really helps to clearly communicate so that there's a level set of expectations on all sides. Allison agreed with all of what you had to say. And then Erica says she loves the defining success. She thinks that's key. So looks like you have a lot of agreement in the audience as well. I want to talk also about knowledge transfer between teammates, especially in hybrid or remote environments, because of course it's still doable. Many companies are operating under these models now, but I've experienced it, and I'm sure many in our audience have as well. It can take a little bit more effort to have that open communication and to share ideas, and if the person was sitting right next to us in an office. So what are some effective ways that we can make sure that knowledge is not just flowing within a company, but it's also flowing across the generations, and we're not sort of just siloed in our group? So Megan, I'll throw it over to you first.
I think that is, it's our new challenge, that the hybrid and remote and in person brings different, I think, opportunities, but also frustrations to many of us. So when we first went into lockdown, we assumed that our younger generation was going to thrive in this remote only. We felt like they had been asking for that. And actually, really quickly, the research showed we were completely wrong, that our youngest generations were struggling the most. Now, of course, this was total isolation, different than what we have now. But I think it brought to light something we were really quick to assume based on generational cliches like, well, the younger people know the tech, so they'll be fine. The rest of us will struggle. It really wasn't about the tech. It was about the different needs you tend to have at different parts in your career. So I work every day with Gen Zs who are entering into the workplace, and almost none of them want a fully remote job or internship, which seems really surprising. But Gallup just recently released some data around this as well, showing that that was true. So I think more and more we're seeing confirmation on this, that, you know, the reason is that younger people want opportunities to network and make their mark and prove themselves and learn things that are really hard to do remotely. And that when you're older, maybe that's something less critical for you, and you may, you know, not have those same needs. So I think it's really, again, what we've been all saying, recognizing those unique needs. And I also think it's really about, you know, if you're trying to convince people to come back to an office and they've never worked full time in an office before, explaining why that's so important, or why we think that has value and what that's going to bring to us that maybe we feel like we've lost. And so I think, again, it's never a one size fits all. I think anytime we use a mandate, like everyone has to come back or everyone has to stay home or everyone has to do it this way, we lose, you know, all of those wonderful differences that we're talking about right now. So I think really thinking about what might be helpful and convenient to one generation about having some flexibility versus what might be the challenge of that. And I would end by saying I've been really struck by the fact that flexibility is the number one desire or benefit for every generation. Like no generational differences in that at all. But it goes back to what we just talked about, that, well, what does flexibility mean to you as compared to someone, you know, 30 years older than you? It might look very different, even though we're all saying we want, quote, flexibility. So I really think it's about asking people, what barriers does your work situation, whatever it might be, remote, hybrid, in person, what barriers is that creating for you, and how could we support you? And also, what do you love about it? I mean, I think those are so interesting to have in terms of conversations, and see in your organization what that looks like.
I think for us, we focus a lot on the central aspect of mentoring. And it's a very inclusive mentoring. In fact, we have a huge mentoring culture within Robert Half, thanks to some of our great team members. In fact, they've just won a Gold Brandon Hall Award for their mentoring program. So hats off to them. But one of the things I think when people say mentoring, it's like new to experienced. I think that's the traditional way people think about mentoring. And we look at it from peer to peer. We look at it as a transition. We look at it as even reverse mentoring. We've looked at it from even a sunsetting perspective and transitioning. So I think when you think about mentoring and knowledge transfer, there's a statistic out there by Gartner that's someone who learns something from a peer or someone that is not their direct manager, they're 65% more likely to try it. And so the whole concept of mentoring is inviting in different ideas and the equity of the value that everyone brings to the table, regardless of role, title, tenure, responsibility, function, and even location. We do this globally. We have people from our Sydney office mentoring with people in our Los Angeles office. So it really does breach a lot of areas that open up some avenues for people that they would never have. So we really, really, really focus on our mentoring culture within the organization because it just seems to fuel that additional retention and that additional level of relationship to people that aren't directly within their work group.
Versha, what are you seeing, Teen Vogue?
Yeah, exactly the same. I want to study Robert Half's mentoring program, award-winning mentoring program, to understand exactly what's going on there. We have some of this in place already. Condé Nast, which is our parent company, Teen Vogue, Vogue, GQ, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, all of these great magazines are under this one parent company, the Condé Nast umbrella. So Condé Nast as a company does have something called the Global Employee Council. We are a global company. And that is like the biggest opportunity, I think, for more junior staff members globally to get a chance to actually interact with senior leaders, the executive leadership team, the highest ranks of company management. That's like kind of the whole purpose of the council, and also for it to go both ways, for executive leadership to hear from people who are doing the everyday like work of publishing these magazines online, on social, in some cases still in print. Like, what are they actually concerned about? What are they interested in talking about? So I think that having something like that at your company or workplace is a really great opportunity to have learnings go both ways and in all directions, honestly.
Yeah. So yeah, same here. I wanted to join all your companies and join your mentorship programs. But for those in the audience, if your company does not have a formalized program, there's still ways that you can find mentors outside of work as well, right? So just remember that that's an option. It can be someone you've worked with previously. It can be someone you know through like a volunteering organization. So it's okay to think outside of the box. It doesn't always have to be such a structured thing if your company doesn't allow it. And then of course, if you are passionate, like you could always start a program internally as well. So just keeping that in mind, just given how significant mentorship can be in helping grow a career.
I wanted to say too, really quickly, that, I love the idea, as you said, like I've had some opportunities to witness what we call mutual mentoring. So kind of the mentoring, reverse mentoring together, but it really informally. So when you said if your company doesn't have an award-winning one and you're trying to get there, I had a situation to observe. It was just a dozen people of different generations that had sort of thrown their hat in the ring as being interested. They met, I think they paired up, they met once a month with sort of a loose structure of things they wanted to talk about, like workplace issues and challenges. And I got to sit in on their final like coffee meeting where they all came together. And what I was most struck by was how many partners said, I just had no idea I would have so much in common with this person that's so much older or younger. And we don't often get a chance to interact with people significantly older or younger because we don't move through the organizations with them the same way as we do people similar in age. And I love that because they found that common ground that we do know is there, but they also learned a lot about how to understand those differences. And, it also just helped create that trust, right? I can't stereotype or generalize someone from another generation if I have a friend at work from that very generation who isn't any of those things that I always hear. So I love that idea of just even casually, informally forming your own group. I think there's so much promise there.
Well, that leads me to a question from the audience. Someone asked, how can we understand the challenges or differences between generations in a way that's unbiased? So it sounds like that's one way, Megan, that you saw firsthand, like, oh, I can't make these assumptions because I actually know someone of this generation. But are there any other ideas or ways that you've seen in your research or otherwise that can allow us to understand without that bias?
I'm a big fan of talking about generational norms instead of stereotypes, because when we talk about stereotypes, almost all of us become not only uncomfortable, but disengaged because we think that's a cliche. All young people aren't great at tech and all older people aren't tech resistant, all those things that we hear, but we aren't necessarily true. But how do you balance not stereotyping with this feeling that there are differences here I'm definitely running into that I don't know how to navigate? And so to me, a generational norm is simply saying, I'm not saying every person in this generation had this experience or is this or likes this form of communicating. But we're noticing we can measure and track frequencies of behaviors and attitudes that ebb and flow due to really interesting sort of forces around us as we're heading into the workplace. So just like we said that Gen Z due in part to their growing up during the pandemic and their increased fluency on mental health, they are putting some boundaries back as a generation at a higher frequency than the millennial generation did. They had that hustle culture at their back. And so they were more sort of encouraged to push and get ahead as quickly as possible. Not every millennial, not every Gen Z, but those norms allow us to say this is a tendency or a swing we're seeing that feels different without insisting that we're going to paint everyone in that generation with a broad brush. And then the last thing I would say is I really love thinking of generation as just one layer of your identity. And when we say that, we can say it's really fascinating that the time in which you grow up and start your career does influence the way that you think about things and see things, but it interacts with so many other parts of who you are, whether that's your gender identity, your race, your culture, where you grew up in the world, your socioeconomic status, again and again and again, all the things we could layer. That's that's interesting. And we need to make room for that. That's how we have much smarter conversations in this area is, yes, I'm a Gen Xer, go Gen X, but also there's all these other things about me that I want to bring into why I feel this way.
I want to jump in real quick and say, I completely agree with everything that Megan said. And I like that idea of focusing on norms rather than stereotypes. And I think I'm, also a journalist by training, and this is the type of field that I work in. But what we can observe about generations, right? Like, what are the actual observable behaviors? And then again, looking at history or the period in time in which they came of age, I think is really, really important, and entered the workplace. So obviously, I think and talk a lot about Gen Z. This generation has gone through so much that is completely different to previous generations because of the pandemic, right? And Rachel Janfaza, who is a regular Teen Vogue contributor, and she's great. You should check out her newsletter. It's all about Gen Z. If you're interested in that kind of information, she has posited a theory that's like there's Gen Z 1.0 and 2.0. And 1.0 was in college when the pandemic started, and 2.0 was in high school when the pandemic started. And 1.0 came of age and earned the right to vote in the Biden administration, and 2.0 had that in the Trump administration. Very, very different circumstances all around. So even just within Gen Z, you can see some observable differences. But to the question of mental health and boundaries, I just really think that keeping, like, COVID, the pandemic has altered all of us, right? That's something that impacted all generations. But Gen Z is a generation that many of them probably started their first full-time jobs remotely because of the pandemic. So there is a transition to physical workplaces and back to office. And what are those norms? And what do they need to learn about that even millennials and younger millennials had the chance to do that in the late 2000s and the 2010s. So I just think it's a really fascinating topic.
I love all the mindset shifts and sort of the reframing of all of this. Kathy, a few people are mentioning in the chat, they loved what you said earlier about leaning into superpowers, which I think ties in well with what we're talking about here, generational norms. So how do you think about generational norms, and how can leaders start harnessing those or like lean into the superpowers, if you will, to build stronger teams?
Well, I would go down the path of courageous curiosity. I think that coming at things from an appreciative mindset versus a judgmental or a critical mindset, I think that's the difference between a norm and a stereotype. So I do think that there's a level of courageous curiosity around what is the value that this generation or this person is bringing to the table, and vice versa. And so I think it's, instead of, having a millennial go, oh, we're going to here we go with the boomer, the Gen Z is going to give me a lecture about something. That I think it's, well, what nuggets are in there that are beneficial to me, and what is the value that I can contribute to the organization? I think we get caught up in a lot of the times about, hierarchy, tenure, titles, authority, and that gets to automatically equate in a traditional sense of value. And then that infers that someone with less tenure, less age, less experience, or lesser of a title doesn't provide that as equal level of value. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that if you're a good leader, your responsibility is to be in service of your team and to help them find ways in which they can showcase, again, their superpower. Like, what is it that their value is that they bring to the table? And it's my responsibility to provide an opportunity and an experience or exposure for them to do so. So I'm constantly kind of on that Easter egg hunt of, how can I help this person be seen? How can I help this person have a voice? How can I help this person contribute value? Because then they feel a purpose. And when they feel a purpose, they're going to have loyalty. They're going to have commitment. They're going to want to have that discretionary effort for the team, for their role, for the organization. And they're going to go home feeling good about what they've contributed, that it's not going to be, I'm a cog in a wheel, I'm a man for the machine. It's that they can identify themselves within their role and that they're adding that level of value.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, it makes me think of an important point that, each employee is going to want different things. So, for example, not everyone wants to be a manager. Not everyone should be a manager. So what are some ways that we can support and celebrate these different paths at work that aren't necessarily, traditional management? Versha, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think like the actual practice of just sitting down with your colleagues or your direct reports and sketching out what that actually looks like in 2025, 2026, and going forward. Again, when we're talking about an industry like media, so much has changed. Jobs exist today that didn't exist 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, jobs are going to exist that like we don't even know what they are. So I think also being very clear about managing expectations is really important. Understanding that, again, the jobs today as we understand them and the career ladders or the paths that we know today may shift next year. So that's why the kind of regular check-ins with your team are really important, to know that you're consistently thinking about this. It's not just something that you think about once a year when the year reviews come around. But we have a great process at Teen Vogue where we have, mandated quarterly check-ins for sure with HR and management, but even with our team, it's much more regular than that, right? Like we're constantly talking about what are the ways that you want to grow, and what are the milestones that you can reach in order to get there.
Anyone else have any thoughts? Want to chime in?
I love, the comments that have been made. And I think it just all comes back to, are we creating a culture where we value different kinds of contribution, that somebody who wants to be upwardly mobile and success to them means I want to be in, the highest level of this organization possible. That's amazing. Let's talk about what it takes to get you there. As well as somebody that says, I really enjoy my role as a team contributor and in this support role that I'm in, or things like that, that's not less than something else, because we all know it takes different kinds of contributions to make an organization run. And so, I think making space for different kinds of definitions of success is really, really important. I also think, once again, just that opening up the conversation. I've had a lot of clients who say, I have this very high potential young employee who wants to be promoted tomorrow. That's not realistic, but I don't want to lose them. And I think that we've kind of locked into, well, how do we balance that? And I think it doesn't have to be, we don't have to give away everything that we've done for a particular reason because the next generation is anxious or wants to do something faster. I think it's a conversation about, I love that you're ambitious and you want to go there, and I can absolutely see you getting there. I would love to be someone who helps you with that. Can we walk through all the competencies or the experiences that we need you to have before you're ready? Right? Instead of it maybe being an arbitrary timeline, unless your industry is very much that way. I think often what people want to know is, there's a future for me here, and somebody here sees me and cares about me and believes that I can get there. And if I know that, maybe then the fact that it can't happen immediately is less worrisome to me, because somebody is helping me figure out what progress looks like, the best way for me to get there. And so I feel like we're hitting that theme once again of really opening up definitions about success, as well as conversations about what it takes to get there in this organization.
I know we only have thank you, Megan, for that. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to close out with a really, really important question that I'm excited about. And I know some of us have alluded to this in the comments as well: career paths. So one of the biggest shifts that surprised me when I started working was that my career path wasn't as linear as I expected it to be, right? I wanted to initially climb the corporate ladder, but then I zigzagged and I moved across teams. I switched companies. I got laid off. I started my own company. So all of these things I hadn't anticipated. I know many of you in the audience probably have zigzags in your own career too. So drop those in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing. But it's really become the norm, not the exception. So how can companies support growth, whether someone is earlier in their career or more seasoned, and sort of help them along the zigzag journey? So Kathy, I'll throw it over to you first.
Yeah, well, within the organization at Robert Half, we have been very diligent about creating learning journeys and being very transparent about those learning journeys. So even if you're looking at it from a linear perspective, but you also, because of the transparency, if you are going to be a zigzag, which we fully support, you know what the opportunities or the options are for that zigzag. And so with a learning journey, we root them in very core, consistent competencies, a lot of the times aligned with the organizational values, as well as universal competencies that can stretch across the organization. So we're continuing to try to help everyone at their, meet them where they're at and helping them elevate their skill set, their competencies, not only from an experience, exposure, education, but also creating an environment for them that they can really thrive and that they know that the organization they work for is committed to their development. We have made a promise by publishing these learning journeys. We continually align all of our programs sequentially to that. And it really does help with either a recruitment, a development, or even a retention tool, because a lot of organizations don't do that for their employees. And when we make that commitment, there's this unspoken reciprocal commitment that our employees make back to us because they know we're going to continue to support them in their development. There's, again, going from that vertical to the horizontal development, we're able to support both. And so if you want depth and breadth because you want to become a subject matter expert in the role that you have, fantastic. If you want to start working towards that leadership track, we have all sorts of opportunities to help you get ready to do that. So that's what I would say as far as career pathing and career journeys as it goes.
Versha, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I tried to mute at the time that I sneezed and I wasn't quick enough. The career zigzag is so real. And what I will add is that I think it's actually a great thing for that to become more normalized and accepted. I think we're all going to be better off if we feel encouraged and able to try new things and to find out what we're really good and passionate about. Again, I just think that's my favorite motivation for why I do what I do. And so I think that's true for a lot of other people as well.
Yeah, agree. I know me as a manager helping others get to that point, very, very fulfilling for sure. Megan, any thoughts from you?
I think the one thing I would add is just that, we want to take what maybe we in our generation, whatever it is, finds implicit. Of course, they know that we think they have a future here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be giving them their feedback every year. We would have fired them by now. We sometimes need to make what feels implicit very explicit, right? That we see a future for you here. We would love to keep you here for as long as possible. Let's talk about what it's going to take for that to happen on both sides. I think the more we can just make that implicit explicit and make sure we don't think that somebody understands that they're valued because they're still employed, or that on the other side that somebody doesn't feel, like they're being appreciated or important, the more that we can explicitly just, have that conversation about what it's going to take and what your career path might look like and the different shapes and how we value those. I think all of those things, as we've talked about today, are how we create those really generationally thriving cultures for sure.
Love that. Makes a lot of sense. And before we close out today, I do want to shift gears for a quick rapid fire round of questions so we can get those last nuggets of wisdom out of all of you. So no more than a few words for each of these. I'm going to ask you two questions. The first one is, what is one thing that Gen Z is teaching older generations at work? So Kathy?
How to use the technology and what emoji means what.
I'm learning that too. Megan, what about you?
I'm going to say how to put back some of the boundaries that have fallen away.
Okay, Versha?
Squaring your values with where you work.
Okay, nice. And what is one thing older generations are teaching Gen Z? So start with you, Versha.
Responsibility.
Okay, Megan, what about you?
I think how to see the bigger picture, just not the part you're playing, but how it fits into the bigger landscape.
Nice. And Kathy, close us out.
Patience.
We could all use more patience. Well, amazing. Thank you all for such a thoughtful and energizing conversation. I love whenever I can get introduced to new ideas, and it's been so interesting to learn about this new way to think about succession planning and really the future of work and how to work better with our colleagues. So, for all of you in the audience, remember that it's not just about figuring out who the next leader is. It's about making sure that we're building a workplace where every generation can really thrive. So, thank you everyone again for joining us. Don't forget to check out the recording and share it with your teams. And I would love to see you all keep the conversation going. So drop your takeaways, drop any other questions or comments that you have in the chats. I love to see so much interaction today. And if you want any more insights into management and leadership, visit Robert Half Insights at roberthalf.com. I will see you all next time.